It was a quiet Thursday afternoon in the small town of Fairmont, the kind of day where nothing much ever seemed to happen. The sun was shining through the windows of Mackenzie's, a locally owned diner that had been a staple of the community for over 2 decades. Alex Carter, the manager of the establishment, was preparing for the evening shift when he received a call from the kitchen. The new chef was asking if the special on the menu for the night was okay, and Alex was in the middle of giving his approval when he noticed the door chime ring, signaling the arrival of new customers. Alex glanced up to see 2 men, Chris and Jordan, both in their late 20s, casually sauntering into the diner. They were dressed in plain clothes, and their demeanor suggested they were regulars, though Alex couldn't place their faces right away. He smiled and waved from the counter, eager to greet the new customers. "Table for 2, he called out as they walked toward the front. "Yeah, sure," Chris replied with a grin, and the 2 men took a seat near the window, the best spot in the house, where they could enjoy their meals and people watch in peace. Alex watched them for a moment, sensing nothing out of the ordinary. He went back to his work, focusing on organizing some of the menus and updating the staff roster for the next week. Things continued on as usual until about 20 minutes later when Alex's phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah, one of his waitresses. "Alex, we need you up here. There's a problem with the 2 guys at table 6. He frowned, wondering what could have gone wrong. He had seen Chris and Jordan laughing and chatting when they sat down, enjoying their time. With a sigh, he left the back office and walked toward the dining area. As he approached table 6, he saw Sarah standing by the table, looking uncomfortable. The 2 men were no longer laughing. Instead, they looked agitated, their voices rising. "I'm sorry, sir, but we simply don't tolerate that kind of language in here," Sarah said, her voice firm but still polite. "Excuse me?" Chris scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "We're just trying to enjoy a meal, and you're making it seem like we're criminals. You refuse to serve us because we're black, don't you? It's the only reason we can think of." The accusation hit Alex like a slap to the face. He froze in his tracks, his mind racing. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "You heard him," Jordan added, his tone cold. "This is racism, plain and simple. You're treating us like we don't belong here." Alex's heart began to pound in his chest as he took in the scene. He knew Sarah, and he knew she would never treat anyone poorly because of their race. But the look on the men's faces was enough to make Alex doubt everything for a moment. The table was silent except for the low hum of the diner's background music, and Alex could feel the tension in the air. "Listen, guys," Alex said, trying to calm the situation. "I assure you, that's not the case. We're just trying to maintain a respectful environment here. Is there something specific you're unhappy with?" "Yeah, there is," Chris shot back. "You just came over here and told us we couldn't sit at a different table because we're black, didn't you?" Alex's eyes widened in confusion. "No, I didn't say that. You were seated at the best table in the house. What exactly are you referring to?" The 2 men exchanged glances before Jordan spoke up again. "We were told the other tables were for larger parties. It's not about where we sat, it's about how we were treated." Alex didn't know what to say. There was clearly a misunderstanding, but what they were saying was escalating quickly, and Sarah's nervous expression confirmed that things had gotten out of hand. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. "Let's just all take a breath," Alex said, trying to de-escalate. "I'll talk to the chef and figure out what happened. There's no reason we can't work this out." But the damage had already been done. Before Alex could even respond, Chris pulled out his phone and began recording. "You're going to want to see this," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Alex tried to maintain his composure as he watched Chris's finger swipe across the screen, capturing the moment. The last thing Alex wanted was for this situation to spiral out of control. He had built this place from the ground up, and it was a beloved institution in the town. To be accused of racism in the very place he worked so hard to build was unimaginable. He took a step back, looking for a solution, but the video was already circulating online before he could even address the issue properly. The moment Chris posted the video, things quickly escalated beyond anyone's control. The clip went viral within hours, as social media users began to spread the video far and wide. Local news outlets picked up the story, calling it another case of racial discrimination at a well-known establishment. People from all corners of the town began to form opinions based on the edited video, and soon, the restaurant's phone was ringing off the hook with angry callers demanding justice for Chris and Jordan. Alex didn't know what to do. He was in the middle of trying to salvage the situation when his phone buzzed with a notification from his corporate office. The message was blunt, effective immediately: Alex Carter is suspended from his role as manager while the situation is investigated. Further updates will follow. Alex stared at the screen, numb. The sudden blow left him feeling helpless and betrayed. He never imagined a day like this would come. He had never been one to take shortcuts, never one to discriminate. But now, his livelihood, his reputation, and his community were all on the line. He stood there in shock for a moment, unable to grasp the severity of the situation. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Clara Moore, a local journalist who had covered some of the town's most significant events over the years. She asked if she could speak with Alex about what happened. He replied quickly, asking her to meet him at the diner. As he sat in the manager's office, the weight of everything that had transpired began to sink in. It wasn't just his career at stake. His friends, his co-workers, his family, everyone was now looking at him as the villain in a story that wasn't even close to being over. The truth was buried somewhere beneath the noise, and Alex was determined to find it. But first, he had to figure out where the truth started and where it had been twisted. He looked out the window, his mind racing with possibilities, as his world seemed to spiral into chaos. He knew that he had to clear his name, but how could he when everything around him seemed to be working against him? There was only one thing left to do: find the truth, and fast. Before long, Clara arrived, her eyes sharp and focused. She had seen how quickly things had blown up, and she was already skeptical about the narrative that was being sold to the public. Alex wasn't sure what to expect from the conversation, but he knew that the truth, if it even existed anymore, was going to be the key to everything. "Alex, I need you to walk me through everything that happened today. I've seen the video, but there's something off about it. I just need the full story," Clara said, sitting across from him at the small, cluttered table in the back of the diner. He took a deep breath, steadying himself for what was to come. "I'll tell you everything," Alex said, his voice unwavering, despite the storm swirling around him. And with that, the investigation into the truth of what really happened at Mackenzie's began. The days following the incident at Mackenzie's felt like a blur to Alex. Every moment was clouded with confusion, anger, and disbelief. The video that Chris had posted online continued to spread like wildfire, stoking the flames of outrage. Alex's phone was filled with messages, both supportive and accusatory. Local news outlets were calling, demanding answers. His suspension weighed heavily on him, but it wasn't just the loss of his job that bothered him, it was the overwhelming sense that he was being painted as someone he wasn't. He had always prided himself on being fair, hardworking, and compassionate. But now, everything he had built was under siege, and he had to figure out how to salvage it. Clara Moore, the journalist from the local paper, was the first person who reached out with a genuine desire to uncover the truth. The more Alex thought about it, the more he realized that the story being told didn't quite add up. He needed to get to the bottom of what happened, both for his own sake and for the community that had supported him for so many years. The accusations of racism were serious, and if there was even a shred of truth to them, Alex knew he had to face the consequences. But if he was innocent, he had to clear his name, no matter how difficult that might be. The next morning, Alex sat down with Clara at the local coffee shop, a quiet place that had always been a refuge for him when he needed to think. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden light through the windows. Clara took a sip of her coffee, her pen poised over her notebook, ready to document everything Alex had to say. "Tell me what happened from the beginning, Alex," Clara said softly, her eyes never leaving his. "The public needs to know what really happened." Alex nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settle even deeper. He had gone over the events in his mind countless times, but now, with someone else asking the questions, he realized how tangled everything had become. "It all started when Chris and Jordan walked in," he began, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "They seemed like normal customers at first. I didn't recognize them, but that's not unusual. We get all sorts of people coming in. They sat at table 6, right by the window. I greeted them like I always do." He paused, trying to recall every detail. "I don't know why Sarah thought there was a problem. She's been working for me for almost a year now, and she's great with customers. I trust her judgment completely. So when she called me over, I didn't think much of it. But when I got there, the two men were upset. They said we were treating them differently, that we were discriminating against them." Alex shook his head, the memory still raw. "I tried to calm the situation down, but they kept escalating. It didn't help that they pulled out their phones and started recording. I told them we don't tolerate that kind of language or behavior in the restaurant, but it was like they were looking for a reason to make a scene." Clara leaned forward, her eyes narrowing in thought. "What do you mean by, they were looking for a reason? Do you think they were trying to provoke you?" Alex hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe. But it wasn't until the video went up online that I realized how quickly things had gotten out of control. I was trying to figure out how to resolve the situation, but it felt like they weren't interested in resolution. They just wanted to make me look bad." Clara scribbled something down in her notebook, then looked up at him. "What about Sarah? Did she ever say why she thought they were being treated unfairly?" "She didn't give me all the details at the time," Alex replied, rubbing his temples. "She was shaken up. But I know Sarah. She wouldn't have acted like that unless something happened. And now, I'm starting to wonder if I missed something." Clara nodded, sensing his frustration. "I've talked to a few people in town. There's talk that Sarah has some history with those two men. That maybe they've been in before and there were issues. What do you think of that?" Alex's eyes widened, the news hitting him like a punch. He had no idea. "You're telling me this isn't the first time they've been in?" Clara's gaze softened. "It's not the first time, but there's more to it than just that. I'm still digging into it, but there are whispers. People are saying that Sarah and one of them, Chris, I think, have history. They might have even had a personal issue before, and it could have bled into how they were treated that day." Alex's mind raced as Clara's words sank in. If that was true, it added a layer of complexity he hadn't anticipated. Could it be that personal history was influencing Sarah's actions? Was that why Chris and Jordan had felt slighted? It was a possibility he had never considered, but it made sense. If there was some underlying tension between Sarah and one of the men, it might explain why they felt targeted. But it also made everything more complicated. It meant that this wasn't just a case of racism, it was potentially a case of personal grievances spilling over into the workplace. "So, what happens now?" Alex asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "Do I just wait for the public to finish crucifying me?" Clara sighed, setting her coffee cup down. "We need to find out the truth, Alex. All of it. That means talking to Sarah, talking to Chris and Jordan, and seeing if there's any footage that wasn't shared. If there's a history here, it needs to come out. The public deserves to know the full story." Over the next few days, Alex worked with Clara to dig deeper into the story. They reached out to Sarah, who seemed hesitant at first, but eventually agreed to sit down and talk. She confirmed that there had been some tension between her and Chris, though she insisted it wasn't anything that would affect her professionalism. However, Alex could tell there was something she wasn't saying, something she was afraid to share. The truth seemed to be slipping further and further out of reach. Meanwhile, the viral video continued to spread, and the public backlash intensified. The diner's Yelp page was flooded with negative reviews, many accusing Alex and his team of discrimination. Customers who had been regulars for years began canceling their reservations, and employees were starting to get nervous. Some were worried that the entire restaurant might be shut down because of the accusations. As Alex sat alone in his office late one night, staring at the glowing screen of his computer, he felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. His business, his reputation, everything he had worked for seemed to be crumbling in front of him. The truth, he realized, wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about holding on to everything he had built and fighting for the community that had supported him for so long. But finding the truth wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't just about clearing up a misunderstanding, it was about unraveling a tangled web of lies, personal histories, and shifting narratives. And the deeper they dug, the more Alex realized that he had to confront something he never expected. The whole town of Fairmont was watching. The question now was, who would stand with him in the search for the truth? Would the community see him as the victim of a misunderstanding, or would they turn their backs on him, convinced by the viral video and the public outcry? Alex didn't know the answer, but he was about to find out. The investigation into the incident began to take on a life of its own, stretching into unexpected directions that Alex hadn't anticipated. The pressure mounted with each passing day, as more and more people weighed in on what had transpired at Mackenzie's diner. The video, now shared thousands of times across social media, had become a symbol of everything that people believed was wrong with the world, a snapshot of racism in action, of a powerful institution abusing its authority. For the first time in his life, Alex found himself on the wrong side of a narrative he never imagined he would be part of. It was a strange feeling. Alex had always prided himself on being fair, honest, and dedicated to treating everyone equally, regardless of background. But now, as the voices of those accusing him of racism grew louder, he couldn't help but feel a deep, gnawing sense of helplessness. The weight of the accusations wasn't just crushing him, it was suffocating his business and every relationship he had worked so hard to build over the years. He couldn't escape the feeling that no matter how hard he tried, the truth was slipping further and further out of his reach. As he continued to investigate, Alex began to uncover cracks in the story that had been presented to the public. He had already learned from Clara that Sarah had a history with one of the men involved in the incident, but the deeper Alex dug, the more he realized that the situation wasn't as simple as he had hoped. It wasn't just a matter of miscommunication or a misunderstanding, it was something far more complicated, and something he wasn't prepared for. The first breakthrough came when Clara managed to get in touch with Chris and Jordan. After a few tense phone calls, they agreed to meet, but only on the condition that it would be an off-the-record conversation. They insisted they didn't want the interview to be about airing their grievances publicly, but rather about finding the truth. Alex, desperate for any lead, agreed. It wasn't long before he found himself sitting across from the two men in a small, dimly lit coffee shop on the outskirts of town. Chris and Jordan looked different in person, less like the angry, aggressive figures in the video, and more like two men who had been caught up in something they didn't fully understand. They were both in their late 20s, wearing casual clothes, and their expressions were guarded as they sipped their drinks. There was a strange tension in the air, as if they were trying to figure out how to navigate this conversation without making things worse. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me," Alex said, his voice steady but filled with underlying tension. "I just want to get to the bottom of what happened that day." Chris glanced at Jordan, then back at Alex. "We're not trying to ruin your life, man," he said, his tone surprisingly calm. "We're just speaking out because what happened wasn't right. You should understand that." I do understand, Alex replied, his voice firm. But I don't understand why you felt the need to escalate the situation the way you did. We were trying to handle it professionally, and it feels like you two were looking for a reason to blow it all up. Jordan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. You don't get it, do you? We're not here to get you fired, Alex. We just wanted to make sure people knew what really happened. You treat people a certain way, and that has consequences. We were treated differently from other customers, and we weren't going to let that slide. Alex felt his heart begin to race. But why now? Why this time? You've been in here before, and nothing like this ever happened. Why is it that this time, you felt the need to go public with it? The two men exchanged a glance, and then Chris spoke up. It's not just this time, Alex. It's a build-up. We've been coming to your diner for months, and we've noticed how things are when we come in. The way Sarah looks at us. The way you and your staff treat us like we don't belong. It's not just one incident, it's been happening for a while. Alex sat back in his chair, the weight of their words settling heavily on his chest. He had always considered Mackenzie's to be a welcoming place, a spot where everyone could feel comfortable, no matter their background. But now, hearing it from their perspective, Alex realized that what he had seen as friendly banter and casual interactions might have been perceived differently by others. He had never intended to make anyone feel unwelcome, but he now understood that intent didn't always match impact. I never meant to make you feel that way, Alex said, his voice filled with sincerity. But I also need to ask, why didn't you say something before? Why didn't you bring it up when you were in the restaurant? Why wait until it was too late? Chris's eyes narrowed. Because we knew nothing would change. When you've been treated like that enough times, you start to think that speaking up won't do anything. But when it's too much, you start to get loud. You start to demand answers. Alex leaned forward, his voice filled with frustration. I get it. I do. But we're all in this together, and I'm not going to stand by and let anyone get mistreated. If something went wrong, we need to fix it, not turn it into some kind of spectacle. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, but Alex was no closer to understanding what had really happened. The more he heard, the more questions seemed to surface. The story was growing more complicated, and it was becoming clear that it wasn't just a case of racism or miscommunication. It was a tangled web of perceptions, misunderstandings, and hidden grievances. As the meeting ended, Alex felt both defeated and determined. He had heard their side of the story, and he knew they believed they were speaking out for justice. But he also knew that the public, the community, was still on their side. The video had already made its mark, and no matter what Alex did, it felt like the damage had been done. Even if he could prove his innocence, the stain of the accusation would follow him for the rest of his life. The following week was filled with tension. The diner continued to face protests, and the pressure from the media was relentless. But there was a new sense of urgency now. Alex wasn't just fighting to save his reputation, he was fighting to restore the sense of community that had always defined Mackenzie's. People from all walks of life, who had frequented the diner for years, were rallying around him. Some offered words of encouragement, others took to social media to defend him, but no one could deny that things were different. The community was divided, and the impact of the incident was being felt everywhere. The tipping point came when Alex decided to invite Sarah to a private meeting. She had been evasive since the incident, and Alex felt like he was losing control of the narrative. If she was withholding information, he needed to know. He couldn't afford any more secrets. When Sarah entered his office that afternoon, she looked tired, her eyes heavy with emotion. The last few weeks had taken their toll on her, and Alex could tell that she was on edge. "I'm sorry, Alex," she said quietly, taking a seat across from him. "I should have told you everything from the beginning." Alex folded his arms, waiting for her to continue. "You need to tell me now. What aren't you telling me?" Sarah took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she spoke. There's more to the story, Alex. Much more. And it's not just about me and Chris. It's about the way the whole situation escalated, and how I wasn't the only one who saw things differently. I didn't want to get you involved in it, but now I realize that I have to. The truth, Alex realized, wasn't just a simple matter of right or wrong, it was a web of misunderstandings, deeply ingrained biases, and a society struggling to reckon with its own prejudices. But in this case, the only way forward was to confront it head-on and hope that the community could find its way back to the truth, no matter how difficult that journey might be. Alex had come a long way since that fateful day at Mackenzie's, but now, the only thing that mattered was finding the truth, not just for himself, but for everyone affected by the events. And even though he couldn't change what had happened, he knew that he had a responsibility to make sure it never happened again. The days following Sarah's admission were a blur of emotions, confusion, and unexpected revelations. Alex felt like he was treading water, barely keeping his head above the waves as the situation around him grew more intense. The diner was still under siege, the protests outside becoming a daily occurrence. The phone calls came in waves, some offering support, others laced with anger, each one more insistent than the last. Social media was a battleground where opinions clashed, and Alex found himself caught in the crossfire of a deeply divided community. The accusations against him still weighed heavily, but now, armed with new information from Sarah, he couldn't shake the feeling that the entire narrative was shifting, slipping through his fingers like sand. The truth that Sarah had revealed about the events leading up to the incident was both shocking and complex. As much as Alex had hoped it was simply a misunderstanding, the layers of deception and long-standing grievances were undeniable. Sarah confessed that she had been under immense pressure for months, feeling the strain of a toxic work environment where subtle acts of bias were not only tolerated but also normalized. She admitted that her interactions with certain customers, including Chris and Jordan, had been affected by her own personal struggles and frustrations. The resentment had built up over time, culminating in the fateful exchange that had ignited the firestorm. But Sarah wasn't the only one with a complicated story to tell. Alex couldn't ignore the mounting pressure from the public, nor the actions of some of his employees, many of whom were starting to question their roles in the fallout. Clara, the waitress who had witnessed the altercation, had become a silent observer in the growing controversy. Her refusal to take sides made her an enigma, someone who had seen everything, yet said little. But Alex knew that she, too, held pieces of the puzzle that could help him understand what had really happened that day. It was Clara who approached him one evening after the dinner rush, her expression hesitant as she stepped into his office. "Alex, we need to talk," she said, her voice low but urgent. She closed the door behind her and took a seat, her eyes avoiding his. "I've been thinking about everything, and I think it's time you knew the whole truth." Alex leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you mean?" he asked, the knot in his stomach tightening. He had a sinking feeling that the story was about to take another unexpected turn. Clara hesitated for a long moment before speaking. "I saw it before it all went down. I saw Sarah's behavior, her attitude, the way she treated some of the customers. It wasn't just Chris and Jordan. It was more than that. She's been running on fumes for a long time, and I don't think she's been honest about why she reacted the way she did. It wasn't just about that one interaction, it was everything leading up to it." Alex listened intently, trying to piece together her words. "What do you mean by everything?" Clara took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "There's this whole dynamic at play in the restaurant. It's not just about the customers, it's about how we all treat each other. The little things, the way people feel about the place, about their roles." Sarah felt like no one had her back. She's been frustrated for months, maybe longer. I don't think she realized how much it was affecting her. But the thing is, it's not just Sarah's fault. There's more to it than that. Alex rubbed his temples, the weight of it all crashing down on him. "Are you saying that what happened that day was more than just a racist incident?" Clara nodded slowly. "Yes. It's not about that one moment. It's about the whole culture we've created here, Alex. The unspoken tension, the way we all interact, the way customers treat each other. Everyone's got their own baggage, and we're all carrying it around like it's normal. But it's not normal, and it's hurting us." Sarah acted out, yes, but she wasn't the only one affected by all of this. Alex's mind was spinning. He had always thought of Mackenzie's as a family. He had built it from the ground up, and over the years, it had become a cornerstone of the community. But now, it felt like that foundation was crumbling beneath him, and there was no way to stop it. The tension within his team had been building for months, and it had finally exploded in the worst possible way. The altercation in the diner, the video, the protests, everything was a reflection of a deeper issue that had been ignored for far too long. For days, Alex struggled to process what Clara had told him. He found himself replaying the events over and over in his mind, trying to understand how things had gotten so out of control. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something important, that there was more to the story than he had initially realized. But every time he tried to make sense of it, new questions arose, and the answers only seemed to complicate things further. As the days went by, the community's reaction only intensified. The protests outside Mackenzie's continued, with more and more people showing up to voice their anger and frustration. Some came to support the accusations of racism, while others stood in solidarity with Alex, urging the public to give him a chance to explain. The media coverage was relentless, with reporters camped out on the diner's doorstep, eager for a soundbite or a new twist in the story. Alex's attempts to restore order in the restaurant were met with resistance. The staff was divided, with some expressing their support for him, while others were openly questioning his decisions and leadership. The pressure was taking its toll on everyone, and it felt like the walls were closing in. Every time Alex tried to engage in a meaningful conversation with his employees, they seemed to retreat further into their own corners, unwilling to confront the uncomfortable truth that had been laid bare. But amidst the chaos, Alex couldn't ignore the glimmer of hope that had emerged. There were those in the community who were speaking out in his defense, urging people to take a step back and reconsider the narrative. People who had known him for years, who had eaten at Mackenzie's every week, were coming forward to share their stories. They spoke about how Alex had always treated them with kindness, respect, and fairness, regardless of their background. They spoke about the sense of family and community that had defined Mackenzie's for so long. It was a reminder that there was still something worth fighting for. But Alex knew that this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been affected by the events of that day, the customers, the staff, and the community at large. It was about finding a way to heal the wounds that had been inflicted, and to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. He knew that it wouldn't be easy, and that it would take time, but he was determined to do whatever it took to make things right. The turning point came when Sarah, with tears in her eyes, approached Alex one last time. She apologized for the role she had played in the incident and expressed her regret for not speaking up sooner. She confessed that she had been afraid of losing her job, of being seen as weak or incapable. But now, with everything laid bare, she understood that silence had only made things worse. "I'm sorry, Alex," she said, her voice shaking. "I should have been honest from the beginning. I was scared, and I let that fear take over. But now, I see the damage it's done, and I'm ready to take responsibility." Alex looked at her, his heart heavy with emotion. He knew that this wasn't the end, but it was a start, a chance to rebuild, to address the root causes of the issues that had been ignored for far too long. Together, they made a pact to take a long, hard look at the culture of the restaurant, to confront the biases and prejudices that had festered beneath the surface. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way forward. As the community slowly began to heal, Alex realized that the events of the past few weeks had changed him. He had been forced to confront his own assumptions, his own biases, and to challenge the systems that had allowed injustice to persist. It was a painful process, but one that had made him stronger, more empathetic, and more committed to making Mackenzie's a place where everyone truly felt welcome. In the end, the truth that had emerged from the chaos was not just about the incident at Mackenzie's, it was about the power of accountability, the importance of listening to each other, and the need for honest conversations about the uncomfortable truths that we all carry. It was a lesson that Alex would never forget, and one that would stay with him as he worked to rebuild his diner, his reputation, and his community. The days following Sarah's heartfelt apology were a turning point, but not the end of the battle. As the community continued to react to the incident, Alex found himself at the center of an emotional whirlwind. The protests outside Mackenzie's continued to swell, with new faces showing up each day. Some were there to support him, some to denounce him, but most were there to see what would happen next. The diner had become a symbol of a deeper issue, and the eyes of the town were locked on it. He couldn't escape the pressure, no matter how hard he tried. Even his closest friends and longtime patrons had begun questioning what had happened that day. It was as though the very foundation of Mackenzie's was at risk of crumbling beneath him. In the midst of it all, Alex couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility for what had unfolded. His mind raced with thoughts of the past, of how the diner had always been a sanctuary, a place where people from all walks of life could come together, share a meal, and connect. He had always prided himself on creating a welcoming atmosphere, where everyone was treated with respect and kindness. But now, the events of that fateful day had shattered that illusion. The divide between the different factions in town had never been so clear, and Alex felt as though he was caught in the middle of a storm that he had no control over. Yet, even as the weight of the situation continued to bear down on him, Alex knew that he had to move forward. He had to make difficult decisions, not just for the sake of Mackenzie's, but for the community that had supported it for so many years. He needed to rebuild trust, not only within his own team but also with the patrons who had supported him. But that would take time, and it would require more than just a quick apology. It was going to take hard work, honesty, and an unwavering commitment to confronting the issues that had led to the altercation in the first place. Alex spent his nights in the diner, sitting in the quiet hours after closing, reflecting on the days that had passed. He couldn't help but replay the events over and over in his mind, seeking answers to questions that hadn't yet been resolved. Was there something he could have done differently? Should he have seen the tension brewing before it exploded? He couldn't help but feel guilty for not recognizing the underlying issues sooner. He had been so focused on the day-to-day operations of the diner that he had failed to notice the subtle shifts in the atmosphere, the undercurrents of resentment and frustration that had been building among his staff. He knew that he had to address this, but the question was how. As Alex sat alone in the diner one night, he received an unexpected visitor. It was Clara, the waitress who had witnessed the altercation that had sparked the controversy. She had remained largely silent since the incident, but now she stood before him, her face somber but resolute. "Alex, we need to talk," she said, her voice steady despite the tension that still lingered in the air. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, and I don't think we can move forward unless we're completely honest with each other." Alex nodded slowly, grateful for the chance to finally have an open conversation. "I agree," he said, his voice tired but determined. "It feels like we're all just skating around the real issues here, and it's time to confront them head-on. What do you think needs to be done?" Clara took a deep breath before answering. "I think we need to address the culture here. It's not just about the incident with Sarah and the customers, it's about everything that's been building beneath the surface for so long. We've all been complicit in it, in one way or another." Alex leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What do you mean?" Clara's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but she pressed on. "There's this unspoken tension between the staff, the way people talk about each other behind their backs, the way we all avoid talking about race or privilege or even class. It's always been there, but no one ever addresses it. I think the incident with Sarah was just the breaking point. It was the catalyst that forced us to confront what we've all been avoiding. Alex sat back in his chair, processing her words. He had known that there were tensions within his team, but hearing Clara speak so openly about it was a wake-up call. He had never realized how deeply these issues had taken root in the very fabric of his business. It wasn't just about the altercation between Sarah and the customers, it was about the larger, more insidious forces at play, the biases, the assumptions, the resentments, that had shaped the way people interacted with one another. He had always prided himself on being inclusive, on fostering a space where everyone felt welcome. But now, he had to confront the uncomfortable truth: he had failed to create an environment where people truly felt safe, heard, and respected. "I had no idea it was this bad," Alex said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. "I always thought we had a good thing going here, that Mackenzie's was a place where everyone could come together. But I see now that I've been blind to the things that really matter. I've been so focused on running the business that I forgot about the people behind it." Clara nodded, her expression softening. "It's not just about you, Alex. We've all contributed to the atmosphere here, whether we realize it or not. But the thing is, I think you have the power to change it. You've always been a leader here, and people respect you. If you're willing to make the effort, I think others will follow." Alex felt a glimmer of hope at her words. He knew that he couldn't fix everything overnight, but perhaps, with the right approach, he could start to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. But it would take more than just words, it would take actions, real and tangible steps toward change. The following week, Alex called a meeting with all of his employees. It was time to confront the elephant in the room, to address the issues that had been swept under the rug for so long. As he stood in front of them, Alex felt the weight of their gazes on him. He could sense the skepticism, the uncertainty, but he wasn't deterred. He knew that this was the first step in what would be a long and difficult journey. "I know that things have been difficult here lately," Alex began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I know that I haven't done enough to address the issues that have been affecting all of us. We've allowed a toxic culture to fester, and it's my responsibility to change that. I want to create a space where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued. But to do that, I need your help. We need to have honest conversations about race, privilege, and power. We need to confront the biases and prejudices that we all carry, whether we're aware of them or not. And we need to hold each other accountable, every day." There was a long silence after Alex finished speaking. He could feel the tension in the room, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. But then, slowly, one by one, his employees began to speak up. Clara, who had remained quiet throughout the meeting, was the first to offer her support. "I think we need to start by listening to each other," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We need to create a space where everyone feels like they can speak their truth without fear of judgment." Others followed suit, sharing their own experiences and perspectives. It wasn't easy, and the conversation was often uncomfortable, but it was a start. They were opening up in ways that they never had before, acknowledging the pain and frustration that had been simmering beneath the surface. It was clear that the road ahead would be long, but there was a sense of relief in the air, a feeling that, at last, they were beginning to address the issues that had been ignored for far too long. As the weeks passed, Alex worked tirelessly to implement changes in the way Mackenzie's operated. He introduced diversity and inclusion training for his staff, hired a consultant to help them navigate difficult conversations, and encouraged open dialogue between employees and customers. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments of tension and discomfort, but slowly, the atmosphere in the diner began to shift. People started to speak up when they saw something wrong, and others began to listen. The impact on the community was equally profound. The protests outside Mackenzie's began to dwindle as the conversation shifted from anger to understanding. People who had been quick to judge Alex began to see him in a new light, as someone who was genuinely trying to make things right. And while not everyone agreed with his approach, there was a sense of hope in the air. The town had started to come together in a way that Alex hadn't thought possible. In the end, the incident that had threatened to tear everything apart had become the catalyst for change. The diner had survived the storm, but it had been transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. And for Alex, the journey was just beginning. He knew that the work wasn't over, that there would always be more to learn, more to address. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful about the future. He knew that Mackenzie's would never be the same, but that was okay. It had become something better, something that was truly reflective of the community it served. As the months passed, the small town began to change in ways no one had expected. The events that had started with a single moment of tension, an accusation of racism, and a subsequent apology, rippled through the town's core, leaving lasting impressions that would take years to fully comprehend. For Alex, the journey of trying to heal the wounds of his business and community had been more profound than he could have imagined. Each day felt like a step forward, a moment to prove to himself and everyone around him that change was possible, even when it seemed out of reach. But change never comes without sacrifice. And it became apparent that not everyone in town was on board with this transformation. The diner, once a symbol of unity, now found itself at the center of a delicate balance, teetering between progress and division. The cracks were becoming more visible, not just within the walls of Mackenzie's, but across the town as well. Alex knew that true healing would never be linear. It wasn't just about opening dialogues or making statements, it was about bridging the divides that had existed for years. It would take much more than an apology, more than a training session. It would take consistent action, effort, and commitment to uncomfortable conversations. One chilly evening, as Alex sat in his office after a long day of work, his phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and saw that it was Clara. It had been a while since they had spoken privately, but the memories of the difficult conversations they'd had still lingered in his mind. Their relationship, like the diner itself, had changed. She had become more than just a co-worker to him, she had become a symbol of resilience, the embodiment of someone who was willing to face uncomfortable truths for the sake of something better. Alex picked up the phone, and Clara's voice crackled through the receiver. "Alex, there's something we need to talk about." Her tone wasn't urgent, but it was clear that something weighed on her mind. Alex sat up, bracing himself for whatever news she was about to share. "What is it, Clara? Everything okay at the diner?" She hesitated, then spoke slowly. "Not exactly. There's been a shift in the staff. Some of the newer employees are starting to feel like the changes you've been implementing are just surface level. They're frustrated. They don't feel like the culture is actually shifting. And honestly, Alex, I think some of the regulars feel the same way. It's like people are holding their breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop." Alex let out a long breath, feeling the weight of her words settle in. He had known this was coming, the road to transformation would never be easy, and resistance was always part of the process. But hearing it so plainly, from someone he respected so much, made him realize that the work was far from over. He had assumed that the initial steps had been enough, but Clara's honesty made him realize that real change wasn't something that could be achieved with quick fixes or well-meaning gestures. It was about the everyday actions, the constant choices, the willingness to confront challenges head-on. "I thought things were improving," Alex admitted, his voice tinged with frustration. "But if people still don't feel like we're getting anywhere, then I know I need to do more. It's just exhausting sometimes, you know? I feel like I'm fighting this battle alone." Clara's voice softened. "You're not alone, Alex. But it's clear that you need to bring everyone in on this. The staff, the customers, the whole town. It's not just about making the right moves, it's about making sure that the people who matter feel like they're part of the journey. Otherwise, you'll keep hitting walls." Her words hit him harder than he expected. It wasn't enough to be a leader, he needed to be a listener. He needed to allow everyone in the diner, and everyone in the community, to take ownership of the transformation. They all had to feel like they were part of something bigger than just Mackenzie's, part of a movement toward understanding, respect, and unity. The next day, Alex called a town meeting. It was the first time he had ever taken such a bold step. He was used to leading in the diner, but he had never imagined that his role in the community could be this influential. The idea of addressing the entire town was intimidating, but he understood that it was necessary. This wasn't just about fixing what had happened at Mackenzie's, it was about addressing the systemic issues that ran deeper, the ones that didn't just exist within his business but throughout the town. The night of the meeting, the local community center was packed. The crowd wasn't enormous, but it was substantial enough to make Alex feel the weight of the situation. He stood at the front of the room, looking out at the sea of faces that had once come together to support him, and those who had turned their backs when the controversy began. Now, they were all gathered under one roof. It was a cross-section of the community, full of varying opinions, experiences, and expectations. As Alex began to speak, he could feel the tension in the room. He had rehearsed his words countless times, but nothing could prepare him for the raw emotion in the air. "I know that many of you are still angry, still hurt, and I don't blame you," he said, his voice steady, though he could feel the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. "I've spent months thinking about what happened, what I could have done differently. But it's clear to me now that this isn't just about one incident, it's about something deeper. We have to address the underlying issues, the way we've been living, working, and treating each other. We can't just keep sweeping things under the rug." The room was silent for a long time, and Alex knew that what he was saying wasn't easy for everyone to hear. But he pushed forward. "I'm here because I want to do the work. I want to be part of a community where every voice is heard and respected, where we can confront our biases and prejudices head-on. But I can't do this alone. We all have to be willing to listen to each other and have hard conversations. We have to commit to making this place better, for everyone." There was a murmur of conversation as the crowd processed his words. Alex could see that not everyone was convinced, but there were some nods, some thoughtful looks. The divide was still there, but this was the first time he had seen people truly engage with the issue. And as the night wore on, other people stood up to speak. They shared their stories, their frustrations, their hopes for the future. Some were supportive, while others remained skeptical. But the important thing was that they were talking. They were opening the door to a more honest, vulnerable conversation than they had ever had before. By the end of the meeting, Alex knew that this was just the beginning. The path to healing wasn't going to be immediate, and it wasn't going to be easy. But there was a new sense of purpose in the air. The town was starting to realize that the work ahead wasn't just about Alex or Mackenzie's, it was about all of them. It was about creating a community that valued inclusion, where people weren't afraid to speak out, where everyone could contribute to making things better. As the meeting came to a close and people began to file out of the community center, Alex lingered behind. Clara approached him, her face tired but hopeful. "You did it," she said quietly. "It's not over, but this is a big step." Alex nodded, grateful for her support. "Yeah, it's just the beginning. But it's something. We've got a long road ahead of us." And so, the story of Mackenzie's continued, but it was no longer just about a diner, it was about a town coming together, confronting its past, and fighting for a future where understanding and respect weren't just ideals, but the foundation of every conversation. It was messy, it was imperfect, but it was real. And in the end, that was all that mattered. As Alex stood there in the quiet of the community center, he knew that he couldn't undo what had happened. But he also knew that the future didn't have to be defined by past mistakes. The community had shown him that change was possible, even when it felt like the world was pushing back. And with that, he finally felt a sense of peace. It wasn't about fixing everything at once, it was about taking it one step at a time, together. The road was still long, but Alex knew that as long as they kept moving forward, they were heading in the right direction.